And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection, your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. An economic shock, or macroeconomic shock, refers to any sudden, large-scale event that disrupts the economy unexpectedly. While not economists agree, many believe that for an event to qualify as a shock, it must originate from outside the economy. On today's Open Connection, we're bringing you Nation to Nations panel discussion, Building Economic Resilience.
I was looking at a video that was done, I'm not sure how many years ago, but it was a few years ago when Nation to Nation was a little bit smaller than what it is today, and it was held at the Sportsplex Arena. And there was, I think it was probably my first time there, and so we were talking about a safe space, and we talked about this yesterday. What does it look like? And my story I tell is that the relationships don't happen in the boardroom or in the council chambers. They actually happen in a third space, and this is a third space, and this is where you bring both the Indigenous or the First Nations people together with kind of the Indigenous culture with corporate culture, and you kind of, take oil and water, and you can't mix them together because they're two different elements, but you can certainly put them together in a jar. And so I think this is where the conversations can begin, and this is where they evolve. So it is, I guess, from the perspective of First Nation people, and even for yourselves to come here and feel safe, because I know some people just are not feeling comfortable in this kind of environment. I get it. You're the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Indigenous relationship person, right? Or relations person, and you have the obligation to be here, and that obligation to be here is not always comfortable. So I think it's important for you to feel the comfort and feel welcome in a place like this. So, the first panelist, we've got a lot of pressure because we're going to build a resilient economy, and we've been talking for the last 2 or 3 days, and I've connected with these 3 distinct individuals who I've gotten to know very well, and I've had some great conversation with them. And so I just want to, first of all, maybe have them introduce themselves, kind of thinking of how we're going to present this, because everyone loves the conversation, and we all want to eavesdrop on this conversation. So we want you to eavesdrop on our conversation this morning. So we're going to start with Daniel, and if you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Well, thank you, Maynard. I appreciate that, and thank you also to my fellow panelists. Great to speak with you today. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. And so I did give a quick little intro yesterday, so I won't say too much around what company I'm with. Rather, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So first of all, I think you'll notice blonde hair, blue eyes, and that's okay. I take on, and you know what? I think we're getting to a good place in society when it's finally the guys with blonde hairs and blue eyes that are getting pushed upon. I think we should do that a little bit more, because at the end of the day, not everybody sees my indigeneity come through. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. My family hails from St. Francis Xavier Parish near Winnipeg, and whether it's be the Pagés or the Todds, we were very much involved within the nation, leaders of the nation before 1870. In fact, my great-great-great-grandfather, Francois Xavier Pagé, was the fellow that led the delegation that met Garnet Wolseley's Canadian Expeditionary Force when they arrived in 1870 and instituted the Reign of Terror. He was one of the first people arrested, beaten, exiled, and my family's been marked through all that, through generations, which led us out to British Columbia, where I was born and raised, and honestly, this is still home. The air, the water, nothing tastes so good, especially when I live in Toronto these days. I mean, you can't even compare. So it's always great to come home, and thank you for letting me come home. I was born in the Stolo traditional territories, White Rock, and up in Mission, Abbotsford area in the Fraser Valley. Beautiful place to grow up, much like this. But my career led me across Canada. And really a fundamental part that I've always focused on is how can institutions relate with nations and actually can build the relationships. Just quickly, institutions are unique types of organizations where they're actually mandated by the Crown to follow through on policy that was set. Towards the end of yesterday, I think great wisdom was shared, I believe through the authorship of recently departed Elder Mel Bevan, on the importance of policy and how that has held down our peoples for so long and our nations for so long. Well, that's why I've always tried to focus in that space. I've worked with public institutions, private institutions, and now with a financial institution. And that's the voice that I'm going to speak on today as we go through our conversation, just to note how financial institutions can step forward and in different ways and can partner. So I look forward to that conversation, and thank you for your time and listening.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Growing up as a first-generation child of immigrant parents is like trying to find a way through a maze of different cultures, family hopes, and dreams. From the first words of their parents' mother tongue to the traditions they bring from home, they're immediately part of two worlds, the family's old one and the new country. Let us return the panel's discussion with Kayvon Hergy.
So my name's Kayvon. Nice to meet everybody. I work for Newmont Mining, which you may or may not have heard of, but we're taking a stronger presence in British Columbia with the acquisition of Newcrest Mining right now. But maybe I'll tell you a bit about my background and the lens I bring to this panel. So I'm a first-generation Canadian. My parents were born in Africa, both born in Tanzania. My dad grew up in Kenya. My mom grew up in Uganda. Her family fled during the coup of Idi Amin. They were persecuted and came to Canada as refugees. Family of 6, rebuilding their lives, sleeping on the hardwood floor of a one-bedroom apartment after my grandparents' businesses had been nationalized. And I bring that up because it informs how I see the world. And as a first-generation Canadian, you grow up straddling two cultures, and you really stand on the shoulders of your parents. And I think that's so important, no matter where you go in life and who you talk to understand and empathize and recognize that that person has a generational lens that informs how they see the world and how they act. And no matter what culture you're from, what community you're from, we all have that background. And if you can tap into that and understand how it's affected you, you might be able to get a sense of how it's affected somebody else as well. For my career, I've had some really great opportunities. I've traveled a lot of this province. I've worked in the public sector politically and in the public service as well at the provincial level and the federal level. Traveled around this province, sat around fires with the chiefs and done those government-to-government relations and learned about what the communities were going through. And I think today I'll really speak about putting a socioeconomic lens on things. That has to be the starting point. And if you are a proponent or working for a company, it's incumbent to first understand what the community is going through before you even are given the opportunity to talk about a resource project. So,
gratified and honored to be here today. My name is David Keir. I'm with Pacific Northern Gas. I'm their Director of Business Development and Stakeholder Relations. Maybe starting on the personal front, I'm Australian born to Canadian parents, which is why I have this funny accent. And I shaved off my long locks just before I came today. You should have seen me yesterday. I was shoulder-length hair. So I grew up in Melbourne. Spent 10 years in Melbourne and 10 years in Sydney. Mum's from Thunder Bay, Ukrainian originally. And Dad was from St. Catharines, Glasgow, Scotland originally. And in Australia, I had a very different career path. So I'm an exercise physiologist by trade. And used to have my own sports medicine facility. So I trained professional athletes. I trained professional golfers. This was a classic fake it till you make it moment. I wrote a book on physical conditioning for golf and became the national trainer for the Australian PGA and the PGA Tour. And I knew nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. It was kind of like the bald hairdresser giving hairdressing advice. Anyway, so did that for 10 years and then moved back to Canada and was fortunate enough to land with a little company, the electricity company in BC called BC Hydro. You might have heard of them. So I worked for BC Hydro for 21 years and then was fortunate enough last February to come over to this little company called Pacific Northern Gas. And so grateful to be there, to be working with folks like Ryan and Chad, just awesome, salt of the earth folks. It's a wonderful company, and I'm proud to be there. And I look after all of their interconnection and supply arrangements. I look after their stakeholder relations, government relations, indigenous relations, their low carbon energy investments, and their demand side management file. So just a few things to keep me busy, and I look forward to providing some context about the importance of energy. If you think of economic resilience, reflect on Diane's comments from yesterday. She said, energy is the oxygen of industry, the oxygen of the economy. So when you think of economic resilience, I think we need to speak about energy resilience, and I'll provide some commentary on that today.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. In 1948, Columbia Cellulose received permission to build a sulfate mill in Prince Rupert. This mill upset the marketing picture for dissolving pulps because cellulose dropped its prices in order to have profit show on the books of the parent company in the U.S. Later, forgetting what they have done, they abandoned the mill as unprofitable. Let us return to the panel discussion with Maynard Angus.
Building a resilient economy. And so when I first saw this title, one of the first things that came to my mind was looking back in the day when we were a resource-based economy, like totally dependent on the resources. I mean, what sustained, we heard yesterday, what sustained Terrace? What actually started the community of Terrace, the city of Terrace, was the forest sector, logging. What sustained Prince Rupert and other coastal communities was fishing. And you go along the corridor all the way to Prince George up into the Peace region, and it was the resource-based economies that actually got the communities going and sustained the communities and actually grew the communities. And so in 1999, on April the 4th of 1999, I was sitting at my desk and I was working for a company called Econ Office Solutions. I was managing the Terrace and the Prince Rupert branch. And we'd been working with the pulp mill for approximately 3-4 months, and delivered and in that day it was a lot of money, about $182,000 delivery of office equipment. And 8 o'clock, the truck was, 1-ton truck was already loaded, and so at 8 o'clock Monday morning, they drove out to the pulp mill and delivered all the equipment. And about 8:40, the driver of the truck came and he dropped a stack of work orders and invoices and receipts on my desk, and I started tallying up, and I thought, what a great way to start the week. And as I was crunching the numbers, the 9 o'clock news was coming on. I turned up the radio a little bit, and the top of the story was Skeena Pulp had gone into bankruptcy. And we had just delivered this $182,000 order that we lost. That was the beginning of the downturn of the industry, the pulp industry, and that happened in April of 1999. 4 months later, David Anderson, as I talked about a little bit, made an announcement and license buyback, license stacking on the fishing industry. The Pacific salmon industry took a huge downturn, and so as most of you know, we've had this kind of this downturn spiral in the economy. And it didn't stop for a long time, and many people lost their homes, and the stories were sad, and it just kept going and going and going. And so here we are today, and the economy has changed a little bit. And COVID hit. We've all heard COVID hit, right? And then what happened? What happened to all the workers? What happened to the way we come together? And the whole world has kind of just evolved in a kind of a different mindset, and how we look and how we do and how we are is a little bit different than how it was. And so let's talk about today and what does that look like. And I'm gonna just kind of open it to the panelists to say, what are you seeing in the economy, and what are you seeing? And we talk about resiliency in economy. I mean, that's a strong word, but we all have this idea of what it could look like, and what is important. So when you think about what is important you're looking into the future, right? So let's talk about what is important for the economy. What do you think?
Well, I'll maybe start off the conversation there. I think more than ever, it's kind of interesting. It's a bit of a push and a pull where all of a sudden the whole world went virtual and was cut off from having in-person direct contact. But at the same time, relationships became even more important because we weren't connected into a single place. We had to actually forge those bonds in new ways and over great distances in some ways. So when we think about that, though, what was critical in being able to do that? Well, certain key pieces of infrastructure. And I think that that's something that I notice a lot when I visit communities or I meet with communities and nations that are not as connected, are very remote in many cases. Certainly in places in northern Ontario, Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, these places are often only fly-in communities or sometimes have a couple seas in a road. They don't have the energy infrastructure. They don't have the broadband capabilities like where I'm talking when the whole world got shut down and we had to find new ways of communicating. So how can those proceed further? Again, having resilient, strong partnerships and relationships in place that have the investment of time, the investment of personal energy, and bringing that together, I think is something that is more important now than ever. So those are kind of my 2 points, just one building on your point around energy and spanning that into digital infrastructure, road and transportation infrastructure, and then finally, community planning to start to figure out for each nation and community's unique situation, what economic development actually makes sense and is feasible, and especially in a high interest rate economy, is as economic as possible too.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Economics is a social science that studies how societies use scarce resources to produce goods and services and distribute them among individuals focused on production, distribution, and consumption. In this final segment of Open Connection, Kayvon shares a conversation he had with a college friend.
When we say economic resilience, it's like saying I'm only going to put 2 wheels on my car. You're missing half of the equation. You're missing the social component. And economics has a tendency to do that. I studied economics in university, and I used to have a running joke with a friend of mine whenever we'd sit down in class, which is, how long would it take for somebody in the class to say person or people or human? Because economics has the tendency to dehumanize people. It calls people agents and actors and all these funny terms. And that always stood out to me is when we think about resilience, we really need to talk about socioeconomic resilience because that has depth. That means you're actually you're weaving the strong fabric of a community together. And I'll never forget the first time I was invited to a Northern First Nations community. I was working for the province at the time in the Minister of Natural Gas Development's office. And we went to a community and I thought I was going there to talk about a natural resource project. And on the drive in, the person who'd picked us up, the gentleman, started pointing out how 8 of the 9 canneries had closed down and the impact that this had had on the community. And then when we finally got to the community and we were sitting around the fire with the chief, and he started explaining how top of mind were things like teenage pregnancy, truancy in the school system, a lack of internet access, all these things that were front of mind well before the resource project was. And it's so incumbent on companies to understand the socioeconomic context of a community before you even open up the conversation about your resource project. And so I think when we think about economic resilience, when we think about resilience, we've really got to make sure we're talking about socioeconomic resilience.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think I want to come back to that later, but I want to actually ask David. And David and I had many conversations. I've known David since he started with PNG, and had some really, really good conversations. But David, you said something in one of our conversations about energy trilemma. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure, Maynard. And perhaps before I delve into that one, I'll reflect on the comments of my colleagues and your comment about the Prince Rupert pulp mill. and tell a little story about the resilience of Little Pacific Northern Gas. The PNG West transmission system runs from Summit Lake, just north of Prince George, through many of the northern communities where you live, work, and play today, through to Terrace, down to Kitimat, and out to the coast of Prince Rupert, 576 kilometers, through some very rugged terrain. That line was commissioned in 1968. And there were three anchor tenants for that line. There was the Methanex facility in Kitimat, subsequently the Econ pulp and paper facility in Kitimat, and also the Prince Rupert pulp mill. And at that point in time, that transmission line was full. I'm going to throw a number at you, and I'm going to use some units. It doesn't matter what those units are. It's 100 million cubic feet a day. Just think of it, there's 100 units. 100 units of gas were moving through that pipeline, and the pipeline was full. And when you have large industrial anchor tenants as a cost of service regulated utility, it means that those big customers are consuming 80% of the volume, 80% of the gas load, which means that they're taking on that proportion of the cost. And the residential and commercial customers that make up the balance are picking up the difference. So for a period of time, the PNG system was fully subscribed. And then in 2000, we began to see some downturn. The Methanex facility closed, Econ closed, the pulp and paper facility in Prince Rupert closed, and suddenly 80% of that load was gone. And PNG, for the last 2 decades, has been working with industry, working with communities, working with customers, saying, how do we get back? How do we rebuild the load? How do we grow the economy of the North? It's kind of like Thomas the Tank Engine. I know I can, and has been huffing and puffing along for the last 2 decades. And we've arrived at this incredible convergence where there's an opportunity for made in BC LNG to be exported to the world to help decarbonize the world. And that's a tremendous opportunity, and it flows in now, Maynard, to the comment of energy trilemma. So what is energy trilemma? If you think of it as 3 legs of the stool, you have energy affordability, you have energy resilience or reliability, and you have sustainability. Those 3 legs of the stool are never going to be equal at any given point in time. The stool is always uneven. It's always kind of rocking back and forth, and you have to have a focus. And we've seen with global events in the last few years, the war in Ukraine has put a focus on what? Energy security, energy reliability. If gas isn't there, if electricity isn't there, bad things happen. So we've seen a focus on the reliability and the security of late. And that then flows directly into affordability. We have to ensure that the energy, the critical energy infrastructure, the electricity and the gas that folks use in your homes and your businesses is priced reasonably. The 3rd leg of this stool is sustainability. I'm going to leave that piece for further discussion on the panel, but that deals with the low carbon considerations of how you take a fossil product and you decarbonize it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection of his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.